Chef Kaniki n'a doit la cité.
Ah, que ça veut l'embrun et quoi? Mouvement-moi.
Makati la zone de santé de Loki. Comité Mbangé, Papi Oblagi, Ndombe Ibonko.
Trinata yule la clade la saga shumja. Que shumbi no kanya menja bokwe. Ma ono yimbi de poka mama kampala o mame yae. Mama kampala o mame yae.
Ingénieur Isabon, Blanchard la maison Jérusalem.
Que n'a pas tu que me gamouche qui? Autre ce qu'on voit pour toi.
Sakata people are indigenous to Central Africa, and outside of mainstream academia, the Sakata people recorded their last occupation around the region we know today as Central African Republic up to Egypt. They then moved to ndombe regions in today's DRC Congo. According to the Europeans' timelines, the Europeans recorded Sakata people would have already been situated within the Congo basin in the late stages of the first millennium. In the 1950s was a time there was an aggressive promotion of the mass Bantu migration line from the Nigerian Cameroonian highlands. In the 1950s, one of our elders who became a bishop went to a Catholic congress in today's Cameroon, and he discovered Bassa people were speaking a language named Ewondo, which had elements of Sakata people's language. Sakata people had the nickname Bassa, which formulated an assumption of Cameroonian descent, which began to develop into an orthodox-like idea of origin. This idea of recent origin from Cameroon began to supersede oral stories stating we had come from Egypt to Central African Republic regions. The section of documented history in regards to the drying of the Sahel is one of the key foundations used to postulate the Europeans' mass Bantu migration theory from the Nigerian Cameroonian highlands. This concept had also been adopted to place Sakata people's origin in today's Chad to support the theory of a migration from Chad into the Nigerian Cameroonian highlands, then down to the Congo basin, which holds together the theory of coming down from Cameroon. I have basically described to you the theory that has been generally accepted within Sakata people's social norms. I will now describe to you Sakata people's origin in relation to what was accidentally first documented by the Europeans and what Sakata people first stated prior to the aggressive promotion of the mass Bantu migration theory. First thing we must understand is there is no early raw material highlighting Sakata people's reasons for arriving in ndombe, which means it may have been unlikely due to the trans-Saharan slave trade activities. As I mentioned, Sakata people told the Europeans they had come from Egypt to Central African Republic regions. It is also rumoured some Sakata people had stated they do not know where they came from, which I deem as indicative of no recent significant event in relation to origin when they're talking about their oral stories. Whilst the history book's story about the drying of the Sahel can hold some truths, it did not mean all Sakata and many other indigenous Central Africans were located around the Sahel during the time the Sahel was allegedly drying up according to the Europeans' proposed timelines. As I mentioned, Bassa was a nickname for Sakata people during the early colonial times. So, Ba as in prefix and then Sa. Bassa is apparently a nickname to allude to people who came from the Sahara. So that Sa is short for Sahara, just so that you're aware. This term was applied to multiple groups during the Atlantic slave trade on the basis of presumed origins as a result of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Mainstream academia failed to highlight the term Bassa originally meant for those who came from the Sudan regions. which is contrary to the Europeans' mass Bantu migration theory. Some mainstream academia scholars had gone on to present the idea of a homogeneous Bassa race and language, which is misleading and not applicable to any group that had the term Bassa attached to their ethnic group. Another thing some mainstream academia scholars will not explain to you, the word Sahara is not an indigenous Central African word and would have likely been introduced around the 16th century from the Arabized and European traders applying generic terms to groups with presumed origins as a result of the trans-Saharan slave trade, in order to make it easier for them to data manage enslaved populations. A key example of this is making an ethnic group name synonymous with the ethnic group that is hosting the coast or kingdom. For instance, the term Sahara would have been introduced to the Portuguese by the Arabs. Within a century, the Portuguese began naming whole coastlines and peoples as Sara or Mashai, Biafra, Iesha people, etc., etc., and this is irrespective of their ethnic group. Another example, the Portuguese understood the term Yaka was used for indigenous interior populations. It was like more or less like a nickname. Within a century, anyone that came from inland were documented as Jagas, irrespective of their ethnic group. This is to highlight there would not have been any interest to carefully categorize people during slave trade activities. In light of the term Sa, it's important to understand the term Sa is used amongst some of the alleged oldest hunter-gatherers on earth, and Sa means forager or bush dweller rather than Sahil dwellers. This allows room for the thought that Sa may not have meant the same thing everywhere at first, but later got misconstrued with the term Sa for Sahara in a general sense. The term Sahara was introduced by the Arab and Arabized around the 16th century, but Sakata people were documented to have been already situated in ndombe around the 9th century or even before that, which leaves strong reasons for questions. It's also important to note Sakata people are accustomed to humid forest-like and shrub environments, which is the same environment of their last documented locations up to Central African Republic region towards Sudan, which is closer to Egypt, I must note. In light of this subject, mainstream academia will not explain to you the forest hunter-gatherer populations in Cameroon to Central African Republic and near to Sudan speak languages classified as Bantu Zone A, B, Adamawa and Nilo-Saharan languages. Elements of these languages can be found in Sakata people's language. I state this to highlight Sakata people's language was once described as archaic Bantu and was placed in the Zone B language grouping, which is closer to Goya people's language. Following the removal of terms such as Pygmoid along with the Europeans' Bantu migration theory, Sakata people's language was moved to Zone C, which leaves more strong reasons for questions. When you remove the Sa prefix from Sakata, you are left with the term Kata, which is what Sakata people refer to themselves as in the past. Kata means inside, as in inside people or cut inside, i.e. a forest environment. I state this to highlight Sakata people would have been around populations referring to their environments and trees as Nzon. In the same manner, other indigenous Central Africans refer to their environments as Nzamba or Nzambe. When the first Kata or Sakata arrived at ndombe region from Central African Republic regions, it is stated the group split because one group became fearful and they were nicknamed Boma people, which means fearful. I say this to highlight if this group of people was later absorbed due to the Atlantic slave trade activities, they may be linked to previous people groups who were taken up to or migrated to the coast of Gabon and up to Cameroon, which mainstream academia does not highlight. Some of these groups who came from Congo are now referred to as Sawa Bantu, and some of these Sawa Bantu groups have taken on the locale name or category Douala, which includes some people who could have originally have been Basa people of Cameroon. It is around this Sawabantu region is where the Ewondo language developed. In case you are unaware, Ewondo was a trade language, meaning it was a language formulated for the slave trade in the same way Swahili would have been formulated for the Indian Ocean slave trade. This is to highlight today people refer to themselves as Bangala or Swahili or Sawabantu because they speak the language which developed from trade. This does not mean everyone speaking the language which developed from trade are all from the same ethnic group. I say all this to highlight our elder who went to the Congress in Cameroon heard Bassa people speaking Ewondo, which leaves room for the thought that traces of Sakata people's language could have travelled up into Cameroon from Congo around the 14th century onwards during the development of coastal kingdoms, causing movements of people. Another important thing to note is mainstream academia ignores the fact that Gabon was barely populated before the 17th century, which is contrary to a mass Bantu migration theory from West Africa, especially if we're talking about population expansion in the way that the Bantu migration theory is presented. Sakata people are known fishermen, and Europeans once noted there would have been already fishermen and so-called pygmies within the Congo basin interiors prior to the arrival of the so-called Bantu, which was ignored following the aggressive promotion of the mass Bantu migration theory. The people already within the Congo basin interiors were likely to be Mongo and Sakata people groups alike. Another matter to note is the people groups referred to as Tivoid people state they came from Central Africa into today's Nigeria. All this supports the idea that Sakata populations and language likely travelled into Congo Brazzaville, then into Gabon and then into Cameroon onwards.
Je veux dire que à cette époque-là, les Douala avaient déjà quitté Congo Matadi. Le peuple démocratique du Congo. Il y a un port là-bas qu'on appelle.
Mongo people described the first beings of the Congo basin from ndombe up to Shrapa as Nzaka people. Sakata people refer to these exact same beings as Mbaka people. This reference could have only have occurred during Mongo people's timeline before the Europeans' mass Bantu migration timelines. Furthermore, there is a legend from the Mongo where their earliest Central African ancestor from the beginning of time was named Ilela, who originated in the Bomba Congo Basin region. One of the Sakata people's beginning of time ancestor is called Ngalela. It must also be noted Sakata people has ancient tales in relation to ongoing war with their Mongo Kundo neighbours leading up to the Shwapa regions. Another ancient Mongo group is Lia, likely short for Lia Nza, who is a descendant of Ilela. Sakata people also have an ancient ancestor named Nzia for short, who is a descendant of Ngalela. These ancient times in the Congo basin would have had what Europeans described as matrilineal systems, hence Sakata people still maintained aspects of these so-called matrilineal systems. Without being aware, Mongo people also had the same or similar systems in ancient times. Mongo Gunda people state they came from the north, meaning north of DRC Congo, along with what we are calling so-called pygmies, into the Shwapa regions today. This is again contrary to a mass Bantu migration from Nigerian Cameroonian highlands, and explains why the term nomadic hunter-gatherer is used to cover contradictions concerning the promotion of a homogeneous pygmy race. So basically my overall summary based on earliest records is this region is basically where Sakata people had originated, along with some Mongo groups, and they would have been situated in the ndombe region around or even way before the 9th century due to their fishermen and hunter-gathering lifestyles. Groups who were biologically like Sakata people who remained in this region whilst Sakata people were already in Ndombe during the peak of the trans-Saharan slave trade could have fled or been taken across trafficking routes from the Kitara Empire up to the Bonu Empire in Chad, and these trans-Saharan activities could have led to what we are calling the Cameroon Bassa people arriving at the Cameroon highlands anytime between the 5th to the 14th century onwards, according to their own documented history, which contradicts the Bantu migration theory taking place 3,000 to 5,000 years ago to make the assertion that Sakata people arrived in Congo basin as a result of a Bantu migration. Now I have covered my understanding in relations to the origins of Sakata people. I will briefly touch on traditions and customs so we are aware of the key things we need to know about Sakata people in general. Sakata live around other indigenous Mongo groups in ndombe, and they are referred to as Lia, Ntomba, Sengele, Mongo-Swa, Ekonda, Iyembe, and further to the west of Sakata territory you will find our Boma groups who live closer to people groups referred to as Teke, Nunu and Yaka. It's likely during the 18th century Sakata people came into contact with people groups commonly referred to as Bakongo people from the Kingdom of Congo, and in this time period Sakata people likely had contact with people referred to as Teke people from the Makoko Kingdom. Trade activities from these kingdoms would have likely impacted the social structures of people living in the Ndombe regions. This is mentioned on the basis we are to find traces of language or culture exclusive to the pre-existent kingdoms that surrounded Sakata people. Prior to European contact, Sakata people lived in a system of 7 chiefdoms, and these 7 chiefdoms are linked to one central system within the Sakata country. Collectively, the land surrounding the chiefdoms would have been utilized in a prehistoric way, resembling that of other ancient indigenous peoples around the world. Sakata people likely encountered white Europeans approaching the end of the 19th century. The Europeans whom they were in contact with were the first to gather ethnographic and cultural material on Sakata people. Sakata people were also victims of mass murder and slavery engineered and committed by European invaders. The European invaders also took chiefs for ransom and tortured them to follow the white man's way via their European missionary schools and institutions. The implementation of Christianity or Catholicism in the 19th century led to Sakata people abandoning a lot of their customs and traditions, along with their created figures associated with their ancient customs. If these figures were not given away to Europeans, they were burned on the basis Christianity, along with the Bible, stated it was evil. Some Sakata groups who retained aspects of their ancient traditions incorporated it into the Christianity that was imposed on them. Incorporating ancient traditions into Christianity would have been done quietly, as the evangelized amongst them would have looked down on such customs. The main chief in Sakata country is referred to as Mojo, who is the bearer of leopards around the environment. These leopards around the Mojo are referred to as Mosengo. A Mojo can only be a Mojo through the maternal line, meaning the Mojo can only come through a Sakata woman. If a Mojo man marries a non-Sakata woman, then the children would usually follow the lineage of the mother from the other ethnic group. Should that same child remain within the Sakata community, they can become a noble within the Sakata society, and these child nobles are usually referred to as Musenvula for the boy or Mukanvula for the girl, and then the child of a Musenvula or a Mukanvula is referred to as a Mosengo. It's interesting to note the Mosengo child is the one who will have the affinity with the leopards, acting as a guardian over the Sakata community. There's more titles for the child status dependent upon the variation of marriage and lineage and nobility within the community. I've just given you the basic and easiest examples to not make this video too long. Within Sakata land, there would have been a planted tree we refer to as the Nshima tree, where the Mojo would lead in discussing issues, conflicts and resolution around the Nshima tree. The communities live on the understanding our ancestors who have passed are living directly with us through the maternal line. The chiefs within Sakata society would have been both men and women, meaning in our ancient times the very person you would visit to discuss an issue could be a woman chief. Within the Sakata societies you have people with the title Nga. The Nga within the community is usually the go-to person for herbs and traditional medicines, who would be operating under the Mojo. Due to Sakata people's maintenance of ancient traditions way into the 20th century, Sakata people had an undeniable reputation for being very involved with spirits, or equally involved in the modern term witchcraft, based on modern day translations of good and evil. In relation to the category of evil, Sakata people would have engaged with sciences considered as protective or defensive for them, but offensive to anyone attempting to harm Sakata people. These sciences would have increased due to dangerous animals around the forest habitats and during wars that they had with their mongo-bele neighbours from ancient times, and during the peak of the Atlantic slave trade. These historical events formulated a defensive mentality amongst Sakata people, which encouraged the continuous development of defensive sciences, which would be witnessed as witchcraft amongst evangelized and normal people. Sakata people use the word Zaon with a silent N, sometimes pronounced Zon, to describe the Supreme Being. The brief basics about the Zaon Supreme Being story is: in Sakata folktale, Zaon created man and woman within the Zaon world, and within the Zaon world, Zaon created a plant between the Zaon world and the planet Earth in order for the first man and woman to go down into Earth. Zaon would have these intermediary beings referred to as Bansho, who are part of the Zaon world, but at the same time can communicate with Earth on behalf of Zaon. The beginning of man on Earth was referred to as Ngalela, as I mentioned earlier, and the first descendant of Ngalela was referred to as Nzia, and the name extension would be Bale e Nzia. These would have been our first ancestors to communicate with the intermediary beings we call Bansho. Zaon would have considered the earth creation job complete, and it would be the Bansho's job to maintain good morale and goodwill within earth. And such key laws were basic things such as if you steal, if you take another man's wife, if you do harm to someone or something, it will come back round to you. There is also a saying which is, before you marry someone, you must know the person's mother and their mother's family first. Our ancient tales and traditions would have been incorporated into ceremonies. Today's ceremonies will include a dance tradition named Muyene, where the dancers usually wear the colour red, likely to reflect the Ngola earth and reflecting our ancient traditions from the ancient Mojo. The most key forms of transport for Sakata people is canoes, ferries and planes due to their interior locations. Sakata people are very nice people, and sectors of Sakata communities are heavily evangelized now. You will find Sakata people are known for keeping themselves to themselves, and today the Muyene is the key form of expression to the outside world when representing Sakata people. Sakata also have a saying which is Abwa Osho Nzim, which means giving birth is worth more than money. I hope I have covered the basics and key things you need to know about Sakata people. Please note I have not exhausted everything you need to know about Sakata people, but I have given the best foundation without going into minute details. Thanks very much for watching this video and feel free to watch some extra slides.
Jado, le je coupe la coco, Congo, Coco Congo, mon amour. Pelé qui te mène le moins nous j'ai. Il est mon acquis, moi. Moi, pas ça, même pour le moins nous j'ai, j'ai pas ta grammatique. Pelé qui te mène. Oh, ya, malela, male, ah, malela, male, ah, ma campala. Yaro, Goliath a joué à me conduire, ça m'a frappé. Elle est rejetée au vide.